In the infinite chronicles of Sherlock Holmes, most cases are born of simple greed, but some are echoes of a long-forgotten past. This is the account of a chance meeting, a trial of blood, a study in Scarlet. Holmes has now established himself as a consulting detective, and very recently he has moved into a new place in London, one that could serve as an office come living space. But due to financial constraints, he has had to share it with another person. His roommate was an experienced doctor and an Afghan war veteran by the name of Dr. John Watson. It has been only a few days since they moved in, and they were still learning about each other. It was at this point that Sherlock received a letter. It was from a certain Tobias Gregson, a Scotland Yard detective with whom Holmes had worked before in previous cases. Gregson has asked for Sherlock's help with a murder case that happened early morning that day. Considering the curious nature of the case, Watson also joined him. The one who was murdered was an American man by the name of Enoch J. Drebber from Cleveland. It was a night patrol officer who saw the body at about 2 a.m. in the morning. He saw a light coming from an empty house, and the door was left open, and the body was lying in the front room. Once Sherlock and Watson arrived at the crime scene, Gregson and his colleague Mr. Lestrade were waiting there. Without much delay, Sherlock began to examine the crime scene and the body. The deceased was a middle-aged man in his 40s. There were no wounds or bruises on the body, but there were splashes of blood on the floor. And at the very corner of the room, there was a word written on the wall using blood. It spelled rage. And once the body was lifted, a ring fell onto the floor. It was a bride's wedding ring. Sherlock then asked to see the items that were retrieved from the man's pocket. Among the items were 2 letters, one addressed to Enoch J. Drebber and the other to a Joseph Stangerson. The first one was of course to the person who was murdered. Sherlock asked whether any inquiries were made on Joseph Stangerson. Gregson replied that an inquiry was made via telegram and they are waiting for the reply. Sherlock then concluded that the murderer was a man in his 40s who was more than 6 feet in height. He wore square-toed boots and smoked a Trichinopoly cigar. He came to the house with his victim in a cab, which was drawn by a horse which wore 3 old shoes and 1 new one. He also had long fingernails on his right arm, and the murder was done using poison. And the word rage written on the wall meant revenge in German. Before leaving, Sherlock took the address of the officer who first saw the body and left to see him without much delay. On the way, Sherlock described to Watson on how he came to the conclusion at the crime scene. He came to the deduction about the cab and the horses on seeing the tracks left in front of the house. As for the height and age of the person, he used his footprint and stride length to arrive to that conclusion. He saw the nail marks left by the murderer on the wallpaper and thus concluded that the person had long nails. And there were ashes on the floor at the crime scene that were particularly made by Trichinopoly cigars. On the way, Sherlock made a pit stop at the local post office where he posted an envelope. Without much delay, they resumed their journey and reached the address. They met the officer, and with a bit of persuasion, Sherlock was able to get the information that he needed. The officer told that he saw a drunk man near the gate of the house after he saw the body and was exiting the front door. He also told that the man was in his 40s and was over 6 feet in height. And at that time he didn't think much of it, so he didn't mention it in his report. Sherlock and Watson then left. On the way back, Sherlock told to Watson that the drunk man was the culprit and he had come back to the crime scene to retrieve the ring. The next morning, Watson was reading the newspaper. He saw the news about the murder on the very first page. Then his gaze fell upon an advertisement a few blocks below. The funny thing was that the advertiser was him. He was baffled. He had no idea about this. The advertisement was about the ring. It was calling out to the real owner of the ring to come and collect it from Watson at 221B Baker Street. Sherlock saw the confused Watson and told him that the package he posted the other day was the advertisement. He told him that he had made a copy of the ring and the murderer or someone related to him will come and collect it. He told that the ring was very important to the murderer and he had accidentally dropped it on Rubber's body after he committed the murder. And he had come to retrieve the ring, but by that time, the police had already reached there, so he had to act as a drunk to avoid suspicion. As expected, a few minutes after their conversation, there was a knock at the door. But the visitor was not a man, but an old lady, and she had come for the ring. She told that the ring belonged to her daughter, and that she had accidentally dropped it on the road on her way back home. Watson wrote down her address and handed over the ring. Once the lady left, Sherlock exited the room to follow her. She got into a cab and Sherlock managed to overhear the address that she told to the driver. He then managed to perch himself onto the back of the cab, and just before it reached the address, he managed to jump onto the road and walked in its direction. It then stopped and the driver got down to open the passenger door. But once he opened the door, there was no sign of his passenger inside it. Sherlock then immediately visited the address that the lady told to the driver. But it belonged to a different person and they had no idea about the lady. She probably knew that she was being followed. So she got into the cab and told the address aloud in order to trick her follower. And midway, she jumped out of the cab. And that she was probably a young man dressed as an old lady. And he would probably be a friend of the murderer. The next day, Gregson came with an information about Drebber. Drebber had been staying in London in a boarding house for the last few weeks. He was accompanied by his private secretary, Mr. Joseph Stangerson. They had departed the boarding house to catch a train to Liverpool a day before Drebber was murdered. Since Drebber's murder, there has been no information about Stangerson. He also told that the murderer has been identified and that he was in custody. His name was Arthur Charpentier, the son of the lady who owned the boarding house that Drebber and Stangerson stayed in. Drebber had misbehaved to Arthur's sister and Arthur retaliated. There were no witnesses to the murder, but Gregson concluded anyway and completed his final report, and Arthur was arrested yesterday. Just as Gregson finished, there was a knock at the door. It was Lestrade. He also had come with a bit of information that Stangerson was murdered early morning that day. He had traced Stangerson's location to a hotel in London, and on entering the room, he found Stangerson's body. He was stabbed and the word rage was written on the wall using blood. But this time, there was a witness. A milk boy saw a man descending a ladder from the first floor of the building onto the street. He was in his 40s and over 6 feet in height. There was a telegram in Stangerson's pocket. It was dated a month ago from Cleveland, and the message contained only a few words. JH is in Europe. There was a glass of water on the table and a small box containing 2 pills. Lestrade handed over the box of pills to Sherlock. At that point, there was another knock at the door. This time it was a boy, one of Sherlock's informants in the city. Sherlock had asked him to arrange a cab and move some of the luggage from his old office to the new one. He then asked the boy to take the driver's help in bringing the luggage to the room. And once the driver entered the room with the luggage, there was the sound of a click. A handcuff had been put on the driver's hands. Sherlock then announced that his name was Jefferson Hope, the killer of Drebber and Stangerson. The man tried to run away, but he had to succumb to the strength of the 4 people in the room. and once they pinned him down, he began to explain his story. In the great deserts of Central America, a man was crossing the barren land with his daughter, a small child. They were tired of starvation and was out of food and water and had almost submitted themselves to death. Their names were John and Lucy Ferrier. Before certain death, they were rescued by a caravan which took them to a Mormon settlement. The Mormons were a Christian religious group based in the US. The leader of that settlement was a certain Brigham Young. Young allowed them to stay there, but on one condition, that they follow the Mormon way from that day onwards. 15 years later, John and Lucy had settled in well among the Mormons. John had established himself as a well-known guide and hunter, and Lucy had grown into a young woman. One day, Lucy was returning home from work. Her pathway got blocked on all sides by a herd of bulls. Panicked, she almost fell off her horse, but a hand held on to her. It was a young man by the name of Jefferson Hope. Hope was the son of a friend of John before he joined the Mormons. He had recently moved into town and was in search of John. Lucy took him to her father. As the days and weeks went by, Lucy and Hope kept meeting again and again, and they eventually fell in love. One day, John received a visitor. It was Brigham Young. He had heard of the love affair between Lucy and Hope. The Mormons had one very strict rule, that they marry from within the community. He gave John 1 month's time to select a husband for Lucy from among the Mormons, and gave the names of 2 young men, Enoch Drebber and Joseph Strangerson, and asked him to select one of the 2 within a month's time. Hope was out of town for work and wouldn't return for about 3 months. The very next day, John got a visit from Drebber and Strangerson. They mocked him and forced him to make a choice. John got furious and chased them out of his house. Drebber and Strangerson vowed to John that they would kill him if a selection is not made within the deadline that Young gave him. As the days passed on, the instruction given by Young turned into a warning, and Lucy and John began to fear for their lives. On the very last day at midnight, John heard a knock at the door. Scared, John proceeded to open the door. It was Hope. He had heard of the news and had hurried back to rescue them. He instructed John and Lucy to follow him at once. They traveled for miles and got past the border of the Mormon settlement. They still had to travel non-stop, but their provisions ran out eventually. Hope advised John and Lucy to take shelter near a ravine while he went out to gather food. He took about 5 hours to return, but no one was there at the site he left John and Lucy. He looked everywhere only to find some horse prints and a freshly dug grave. On it was written, John Ferrier. There was no sign of Lucy. They had taken her back to the settlement. He went back only to hear the news that Lucy had married Drebber and Strangerson was the one who killed John. A month later, Lucy had passed away, and the cause of the death was unknown. And all of the wealth and property that John had made through years of hard work had gone to Drebber. Hope went to Lucy's funeral and managed to get hold on to a wedding ring and ran away with it. He didn't want her to be buried with it on her. As the years went by, the vengeance grew within him. He tried many times to take the lives of Drebber and Strangerson, but to no avail. Gregson and Lestrade took Hope into custody. As of how he executed the murders, he took Drebber to the empty house at gunpoint and forced him to consume one of the 2 pills in the box. He gave Drebber a chance to live, as only one of the 2 pills in the box had poison. But luck was against Drebber. he consumed the one with poison. As for Strangerson, he refused to consume the pills, so Hope had to stab him. Sherlock knew that a cab driver was behind the murder. Using the deductions that he made at the first crime scene, he was able to locate Hope using his informants in the city. Anyway, Hope's mission was completed and he no longer held revenge in his heart.